Okay, so here we are once again, back from yet another intermission. And today we're going to be getting into talking about Arthurian Romance and one of the great Arthurian romances in Middle English. But before we do that, let me catch up on a couple of still loose ends. One of them is that one of our students asked me after class last time about writing on a woman poet and a work of hers that contained quite a number of poems, and how would you handle something like that? Well, notice that I think the examples that I gave when I was talking about the assignment way back when in the beginning lecture, which was essentially the orientation to what we were going to be doing in the course, and I was talking about the topic for the term paper, and I was suggesting that one of the easiest things to do would be to take a novel or a play or some other long work, maybe a long narrative poem or something like that, by your author, but it may be that you're going to run into several shorter pieces by your author. And that's perfectly okay too, so that you could take a poet and take maybe a series of shorter poems and take those as a grouping and look at those together. Or one of the things that you will find, if you haven't found this already, and no doubt you're having begun your research by now, many women, especially by the 17th and 18th centuries, though this does start considerably earlier, wrote letters. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, letter writing was considered an art in and of itself. That's something that we've tended to lose a sense of. If we write letters at all, nowadays it's probably emails, which are fairly brief. But people used to actually write letters, and then they would frequently revise their letters as literary works themselves, often with an eye towards future publication. And as a matter of fact, in the 18th century, and this continued on to the 19th century, and with certain notable figures, it continues even to very recent times, people's letters would be published. And the letters could be studied as literary works themselves, with literary qualities, where people would deliberately insert poetry or narratives. They would polish the style of their letters. In other words, they took these very, very seriously. And some people wrote hundreds, and in some cases even thousands of letters. And so correspondence was very, very common among literate people. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody was literate, but literacy rates are going to be rising toward the end of the Middle Ages. Still only a minority of people will be literate in Chaucer's time. But within another century or two, those literacy rates are going to be going up significantly. And one of the things that's going to rise or cause the literacy rates to rise is going to be the translation of the Bible into the vernacular tongues of Europe, the vernacular tongues being languages other than Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. I'm talking about the ancient versions of those. And the translations of the Bible into English and German and French and so forth, so that the Bible then became not only very accessible to people, but with the Protestant Reformation beginning in the early 16th century, there was a real push to get everybody to learn how to read so that they could read the Bible for themselves. So this became one of the principal promoters of the development of literacy throughout Europe from that point on. And that's part of the story that we'll be getting into a little bit more later on in our survey here. But I'm simply saying now that even in the later Middle Ages, there was an increasing number of literate peoples, especially in that rising middle class that we have been talking about in connection with Chaucer. People were educated. They either went to school or they were educated in the home. They had tutors if they were well off enough to have tutors, or they would have literate parents who would teach the children how to read and write. So increasingly, this became a middle-class accomplishment as well as an accomplishment for the upper classes. And as a matter of fact, as the middle classes began to learn to read and write more and more, that put pressure on the upper classes to do so. Throughout much of the Middle Ages, many people of the nobility were illiterate because they didn't think that they had to know how to read and write. After all, they had servants who could do the reading and writing for them. And that was one of the things that they hired clerks for. Remember, I said that if you were trained, as our clerk is in the general prologue, if you were trained at a college or at a university and you decided not to go into the clergy and become a religious official, then where would you go? Well, there were so many positions open in secular life. One of them was to be a secretary. Now, secretary meant a lot more than what you or I usually mean by a secretary as someone who works in an office. The secretary would be the person who would read documents, letters, and so forth aloud to the person for whom he worked, possibly in some cases she worked. But notice that the patron could very well be a noble woman, an upper class woman or upper middle class woman as well as man, who would have a secretary. And the person would read aloud letters, documents, and whatnot, or literary works for that matter, or religious works to that person, or maybe to an assemblage of such persons. We have lots of evidence of that. And then, of course, the other duty of the clerk would be to take down, in a form of dictation, letters, documents, other kinds of things. And this was a very common form in which information, ideas, experiences, narratives, songs, poems, and so forth were transmitted around from one community to another. So literacy took variety of forms. And of course there could be partial literacy or marginal literacy as well, where some people would have some ability at reading and writing but wouldn't be really very proficient at it. So what does all of this have to do with our problem here? Well, my point here is that increasingly people were getting into the social exercise of writing letters and taking that increasingly seriously. So you may well find, if you choose a woman writer of the 18th century, that what you're getting yourself into is a whole collection of letters. And that's fine. That's fine. It may be, as in the case of someone who gets into a writer who has a whole collection of poetry, that you would want to be selective and have, say, her letters from a particular period or dealing with a particular narrative or particular kinds of social, cultural, familial history or something like that. So, is that clear, what I just said? Are there any questions about that? Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to pick up on was what we didn't have time for at the tail end of our class last time. And that is to conclude our discussion of the marriage group in the Canterbury Tales. Very, very briefly to summarize where we are now. Remember, the wife of Bath starts off the debate over who should have mastery in marriage, not only in her prologue, but then in her tale, telling a story in which the moral is supposed to be that that marriage is happiest in which the woman has mastery and the husband yields mastery to her. The clerk responds with a story about a husband who tests his wife's loyalty almost beyond belief, but she takes it and takes it and takes it and takes it and takes it, and then finally she is rewarded, if one were to call this a reward, by being accepted fully by her husband, who then embraces her and says that he loves her forever as his wife. Well, the moral of that story, at least on the face of it, would appear to be that that marriage is happiest in which the woman remains subservient to her husband, who therefore has the mastery in marriage, despite a disclaimer in a little epilogue by the clerk that he was really talking allegorically about the proper relations between Christians and God. Nevertheless, he has chosen to tell a story about a husband and wife. And so, at least at the literal level of the narrative, it would appear to be an important player in the whole marriage group, in the game of the marriage group. Then we have the Merchant's Tale, which I'm not going to go into in great detail, except once again to say that you have a much older husband, as we did in the Miller's Tale, who has married a young girl. She's a teenager. We don't know exactly how old he is, but he seems to be, if not 70s, pushing 70. So we're talking about not, one of those debatable cases, well, how old is old? But this guy is maybe 50 years old or thereabouts than his young wife. And yet he preens himself on his sexual prowess, which is also very, very funny, the way Chaucer satirizes this guy. But in the meantime, there is a young lover, as in the case of the Miller's Tale, who is going to make advances to the wife. The wife becomes interested. They end up having a love affair. The husband appears to find out, but through an elaborate set of deceptions, he is gulled to the extent that he believes that his wife is really being faithful to him after all, and that this was simply a mistake. And so what we have, according to Kittredge's theory of the marriage group, is, in this case, a very cynical view of marriage and a cynical view of the relations between men and women in marriage. And then we come to the Franklin's Tale, which, according to this theory, as I've mentioned briefly before, is supposed to provide an egalitarian view of marriage in which the husband and wife are equal partners and share equally in decisions. And they aren't making power moves or trying to struggle with one another to achieve power over the other. Well, we look at the tale itself, and I'm not asking you, and I'm not requiring you to look at the tale here, but I'm using this as an illustration of how a grouping in the Canterbury Tales can actually work, and also as an illustration of the principles of the dramatic principle that we've been talking about for the last few class meetings. So in the Franklin's Tale, told, remember, by what in the 18th century came to be called a country squire, that is to say, a very well-off, large landholder, not a member of the nobility, but nevertheless someone who was very well off in what came to be called the gentry. The gentry. And the gentry in the British system are people of the upper middle class who are significant landholders, who are called gentry, and who have the right to have a coat of arms. Coats of arms in England were not accorded only to members of the nobility. They were also accorded to members of the gentry as well. And these are what later on came to be known as county people. That is to say, the people who really ran the county governments. Well, that's to get a bit ahead of the story too. So the Franklin now begins his story with a knight who is very, very desperately in love with this young woman, and so he woos her, and he eventually wins her affections, and they get married. And he is, up to that point, the ideal courtly lover. And then he says to her, well, even after we are married, things are not going to change. It's not that I was courting you as the courtly lover in order to marry you, and now, having married you, everything has changed. Now I'm the boss, and I'm the one in charge of the marriage and the household, and so forth. He says, no, I will continue to be your servant. And she goes, okay. He says, with one exception. In public, we'll have to make it look the other way around. Because, you know, after all, we're talking about being in public. Well, of course, already there's a certain fudging going on here, right? So, and maybe even if you want to be a little stern about this, maybe even some hypocrisy going on. Well, in due time, the husband goes away. And he's going to go away to the wars because this is where he's going to win his fame and fortune and his honor, prove his honor, and so forth. And so in the meantime, naturally enough, you know what's going to happen. There is a young man who comes and begins to court and to woo the wife. And he is a would-be courtly lover for her. And finally, he is able to find her in this open area, kind of garden-like area, but an open area, an unenclosed garden. Now, in medieval iconography, let me use this word. I'm going to tell you what iconography means, then I'm going to tell you what happens in medieval iconography. Are any of you art history majors? Any art history students here? This is a term that we borrow from our friends in art history. Art historians all the time talk about iconography. Okay, I-C-O-N. Iconography means, I mean, if you were to break that down, it's a compound of two Greek words. The first one, I mean, you've heard the word icon. The first one is the Greek word for an image, especially a visual image, a visual image. A visual image in religious art, frequently enough, of the Blessed Virgin Mary with the Christ child. That's a very, very common icon in Greek or in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And the graphy part of this comes from a Greek word which means writing, So iconography is writing with images, not writing with words, but writing with visual images, Now, when we write with words, we're really using a symbolic system, aren't we? So also, if we write with pictures, we are using those images symbolically. So that if you were to look at, let me give you a good example. In our Museum of Fine Arts, we have I think it's on the second floor, there is a statue, and if you're standing in a certain position, you're looking through a series of galleries down a kind of hallway, and you can see this piece of sculpture, which was done, I believe, in the 18th century during the neoclassical period that we're going to be talking about toward the end of the course. And it is of a nude female figure, life-size statue of a nude female figure. Nothing unusual about that. I mean, God knows the history of art is filled with nude figures, female and male. And so you wonder, well, what is specific or particular about this image? Well, if you get close enough, you'll notice that she is holding in her hand an apple. Well, what does that mean? the iconography of that image. Do you know what it means? That's very good, Eve. That really is very good, except in this case, it's not Eve. She has her hair all bound up in a Greek style, by the way. I should have added that, and that would have given you another clue. So, do you have another shot at?
With the golden apple.
Exactly, Aphrodite with the golden apple. There is the test among the, or game among three Greek goddesses over who is really the most beautiful. And this, by the way, is what starts off the whole Trojan War, according to Greek mythology, and and Homer alludes to this myth at various times. But you're absolutely right that at one point Paris, the Trojan prince, awards the golden apple, the prize, which signifies who is the most beautiful of them all, to Aphrodite, in return for which, by the way, he gets Helen, because Aphrodite is not simply the goddess of love, but she's in particular the goddess of sexuality. And so she gives to him the most beautiful and attractive, woman in the ancient world. Only problem is that she's married to somebody else, and that causes the conflict which leads to the Trojan War. But you're right. See, this is iconography. But in another context, you're right too, that we could have Eve with the apple, particularly if we had a woman standing near a tree and there was a serpent in the tree. And that's a very common image, isn't it, in Christian art? And iconographically, we would know that that was Eve, and that this was the temptation of Eve. So, one of the conventions in medieval art was that the woman not only is associated with a garden, a place of flowers, of beauty, of fertility, of life, but also a woman could symbolically be a garden. So, or a garden could take on the qualities of the woman. An enclosed garden meant that the woman was either a virgin or a faithful wife, let's say. But a woman who is in an unenclosed garden is opening herself up to advances from prospective lovers. In The Merchant's Tale, the wife, the young wife, even has a key made to her enclosed garden for her young lover to get into her enclosed garden so that they can make love together in a pear tree. So see how symbolically the garden can be used either as an enclosed garden or an unenclosed garden? Well, that's what happens in iconography. In effect, writing with visual images, as is done in sculpture and painting and whatnot. So also, now of course in cinema and television. But this can be taken over in certain ways in literary works too. So anyway, the young would-be lover approaches the lady in an unenclosed garden, and she says, okay, yeah, I'll become your lady love if you can make the rocks off the coast of Brittany go away, those same rocks that she fears her husband may have his boat be wrecked on, and he would die as a result of drowning. She says, you make those rocks go away, and then, yeah, I'll be your lady love. What she's really doing is something like saying, if it were in our time, okay, you get strong enough so you can lift up the Empire State Building, and then I'll be your lover. Okay, she's obviously deliberately giving him an impossible task. Well, he goes off feeling somewhat dejected, but he runs into a magician, and the magician teaches him a trick on how to make the rocks appear to go away. They can't actually go away, but to appear to go away. So he comes back, plays the trick. She thinks, oh my God, he's made the rocks go away. Now I have to make love to this guy. but I don't want to. I want to be faithful to my husband. And so she is so depressed over all of this that she even considers committing suicide. At which point the husband comes back and says, "Why are you so dejected?" And she tells him all. And he says, "Well, you know, you're an honorable person. I'm an honorable person. You're going to have to do the honorable thing. You're going to have to go and sleep with this guy. And, you know, you are now honor bound. You have given your word. And he has met his part of the bargain, so you have to fulfill your part of the bargain." Which is all very strange, right? You know, and you wonder, she doesn't want to, you understand. She really, really doesn't want to, even to the point of contemplating suicide rather than giving in to the young lover or would-be lover. But her husband is pushing her into this. Well, she goes to the guy and she says, you know, "Okay, but this is not my idea." And she tells about the husband pushing her into this because it would otherwise be breaking her honor to break her word. And the young fellow is so impressed by this generosity that he lets her off of the bargain. He, of course, still has to pay the magician who taught him the trick in the first place. He goes and tells the magician about this, and the magician is so impressed by his generosity and the husband's generosity that he lets him off of the hook for what he owes him. And so at the very end of the tale, the Franklin looks to his fellow pilgrims and says, "Which of these is the most affray?" The Middle English word "fray" meaning generous, and turns that to the audience to debate, discuss, and try to come to some decision about. And that, by the way, is a literary device that was continued on into Elizabethan times, Tudor times, where you would have a poem or a narrative or a play that would not end with any definite resolution, but would conclude by either the poet or the tale teller or the actors in the drama turning to the audience saying, "How do you think this should come out?" And then that would become a kind of game for people to try to figure out how things should come out. We still occasionally have plays that do that sort of thing, you know, where the ending is left open every single performance. Okay, so we go back and we think, well, wait a minute now, is this really an egalitarian kind of marriage? I mean, it starts out with him saying, well, I'm going to be your courtly lover and continue to be your servant, except in public. You know, because after all, I'm a guy, you know, and I've got to keep up maintain face, you know, with all the other people in the court. So there's that. Then it is not she, but he who wants to push her into having the affair with the young would-be lover. Well, is that the ideal of a marriage, you know, and of sharing equally in decisions in the marriage? Well, I think that most of us would hardly agree. So anyway, this, you know, this marriage may on a certain surface level appear to be a kind of shared and egalitarian relationship. But once you actually begin to analyze it in detail, that argument begins to fall apart. So, okay, nevertheless, we do have a grouping of tales. Whatever you think all of those tales mean, you do have a grouping of tales in the Canterbury Tales in which you have people in the frame story, the pilgrims, interacting with one another through telling stories which are expressive of their own characters and of their own views on the subject of marriage. And they differ, obviously, with one another and from one another, but those differences are expressed in the activity of tale telling. Okay? The dramatic principle, once again. All right. So, any questions about this before we leave Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales? We could go on and on and on. You know, we have a whole junior, senior level course devoted entirely to Chaucer, in which you have a lot of fun reading this kind of material at great length. So, who says, by the way, that all literature has to be sober and serious and ponderous? Some of our greatest literature is comic and is fun. And why not? So, having said that, let's go to talking a bit about the development of Arthurian romance. And Scott, if we can go to, thank you very much. You'll recall that going way back to the beginning of the course, I talked a little bit about this, and then I said we're going to talk more about it later. Perhaps partly based on the historical figure of Ambrosius Aurelianus, who, according to the Welsh priest Gildas, in a very, very early British history, led British and Romano-British or Romano-Celtic forces to victory over the Anglo-Saxons around the end of the 5th or the beginning of the 6th century. That's at least possible. We don't know that for sure. But scholars have been able to find this reference and believe that they've been able to trace a line of influence from these legends about Ambrosius Aurelianus in the early Middle Ages in Britain all the way to the emergence of full-blown Arthurian romances in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially the 13th century. Now, Gildas, as I mentioned when we were talking about this earlier, identifies this site as Mons Badonicus in the Latin Chronicle, or in English this would be Mount Badon, B-A-D-O-N. Nobody knows exactly what that might be, but if you go to the southwest of England and over the border into what is now Wales, you will not only find mountains, but you will find a lot of the early legends associated with Arthur. So if there was indeed a Mons Badonicus, it was probably in that general area of England or along the borderline perhaps with Wales. Okay. Now scholars, especially Celtic scholars, in the literature, folklore, and cultural history of early Britain, have often claimed that this historical figure, as I've mentioned now, entered into Welsh and Irish lore, emerging eventually as the figure of Arthur and the other characters in these legends, being the origins of the knights and ladies of the Round Table. And the first major work in which we find this newly emerging Arthurian literature is in the 12th century History of the Kings of Britain by one William of Malmesbury. A generation later, we have the full-blown romances being written in France by one Chrétien de Troyes. And I've mentioned Chrétien here before when we were talking about courtly love. And we'll pause and talk a little bit more about Chrétien here today. Chrétien was one of the first great Romance writers. French, obviously. Okay? If you need to, tell me to slow down. Okay? Chrétien's best known Arthurian romances are the Lancelot and the Perceval. I've already mentioned a little bit about the Lancelot, but basically what happens in that is that the story begins with Arthur having a Christmas, New Year's celebration, you know, the holiday season celebration. And, you know, somebody inevitably comes in. We're going to see this in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight also. Almost inevitably comes in to ask for some kind of a boon from Arthur. Because Arthur generally will not start eating or drinking until some marvel has occurred. Well, obviously nobody in the court can start eating and drinking until the king starts eating and drinking. So everybody's sort of sitting around impatiently waiting for a marvel to occur. Well, in this case, a marvel occurs with this figure coming into the court, just like later on we're going to see the Green Knight coming into Arthur's court. And the upshot, I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but the upshot of this is that this figure gets a rash boon. Remember the rash boon? The rash promise. I will give you anything you want, anything you ask for. Gets the rash boon from Arthur and then takes Guinevere, Arthur's queen, away. Well, of course, everybody's in an uproar. And so Arthur sends his best knights out in quest for the lady, to find her and to bring her back. And the two principal knights who engage in this quest are Lancelot and Gawain. Lancelot eventually does get there. He does actually find Guinevere. He does finally convince her that he has now become desperately in love with her, and they begin a tortured love affair. And remember, I mentioned this when we were talking about courtly love earlier, that the romances typically deal with some kind of a conflict between love and honor. And one of the ways in which they can exploit the tension between love and honor is to have a married couple with a third person coming in who falls in love with, you know, the appropriate person in the married couple. And then, of course, all of these tensions begin to develop. Okay? And as I mentioned a couple of classes ago, one of the problems here, of course, is that not only is Arthur Lancelot's lord, to whom he owes his loyalty, under a very, very strict code of chivalry, but Arthur is also Lancelot's best friend. So notice on both counts, if Lancelot has an affair with Guinevere, he is going to be betraying Arthur. Well, they do have this tortured relationship in which they just come together very briefly, by the way. And remember something else that I talked about when we were talking about courtly love? That in these romances, the lovers don't get to enjoy being together. They are tormented. They're absolutely tormented the whole time. And they're constantly being separated. And they're constantly being frustrated. And these romances involve much more frustration than they do fulfillment. And that's how they maintain a level of interest, excitement, tension through sometimes very, very long narratives and complicated plots. Well, the Perceval is the story about the the Holy Grail. Oh, by the way, of course, you know, Lancelot ultimately is not going to be able to have Guinevere. And ultimately, this is going to tear apart. This doesn't happen in Chrétien's romance, but in other later romances, such as Sir Thomas Malory's Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur. This relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere ultimately tears apart Camelot, the Round Table. And so it leads to the death of Arthur, the destruction of the whole ideal of the Round Table at Camelot. And, you know, Lancelot is going to go off and become a lonely kind of ascetic figure. Guinevere is going to go off to a nunnery, and it's really a sense of the ending of everything, except that there is a myth which persists for a very long time, that Arthur was taken away by maidens on a barge to some faraway island, and that Arthur will return at some future time when most needed by his people. And that's why he is sometimes referred to as the once and future king. And he fulfills a kind of pattern of such figures, and you find them elsewhere. You find it, for example, a friend of mine who's a professor at the University of Georgia worked out the same kind of pattern with one of the great heroic figures of Wales, of early Wales, who also is the once and future king, as it were. So anyway, that's a relatively common pattern in myth and in folklore and in legend. So, what do we say about Percival? Well, that's the story of the Holy Grail and the attempts of Arthur's knights to achieve the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail is supposed to have been the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper in the Bible story. And after his death, this passed to Joseph of Arimathea, the guy who offers his tomb for Jesus to be buried in, and then it gradually migrates, according to legend, to Britain, and then is lost. So Arthur sends his knights out in quest of the Holy Grail. One of the principal knights in this case is the unlikely figure of Percival. Well, without going into all of the story here now, because it's not pertinent to our discussion, these are two of the most famous early Arthurian romances. These are in the 13th century. They take over and are just enormously popular. And so you have these Arthurian romances developing all over the place, not only in England, but in the German-speaking countries, in Italy, Spain, throughout France, of course, and so on and so on and so on. Well, there are conservative historians, if we can go back to the PowerPoint, please, such as David Dumville, who's a contemporary of ours, an English historian, who is very skeptical of these legends of Arthur. And he raises all kinds of questions about claims for the historical origins of Arthur and the legends of those surrounding Arthur. But whatever the historicity of Arthur may be, he provided material for one of the greatest and most widespread bodies of world literature. A huge body of world literature. And as I mentioned earlier on in the semester, there's even a Hebrew Arthurian romance that was discovered just a few years ago. So, how does all of this apply to English literature? Well, there are a number of very important English works, not the least of which, as we are going to see here, is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But perhaps the best known of them all is Sir Thomas Malory's Mort d'Arthur. And Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur was done in the 15th century, and I'm just going to talk briefly about that, but that's not on the syllabus, and I'm not going to hold you accountable for that on the final exam. But Malory's Morte d'Arthur, and let me write down how you spell Morte d'Arthur. Let's erase this first. Okay. The author's name is Malory. Le Morte d'Arthur, and or Death of Arthur. And of course, because these romances in large part had come from France, there are a lot of French elements that are in even the English romances. Here, of course, in the title. Malory is an interesting guy, 15th century knight who was one of that group of knights who were out of work. After some of the great battles were over and the wars were over and there was relative peace taking place in the middle to latter part of the 15th century, you had all of these knights and other professional soldiers who were out of work. What did they do? Well, they went back and, worked on their farms or in their shops and so forth, or other lands to the extent that they could, but some of them formed into armed bands of outlaws. I mean, after all, these are very dangerous people. These are professional soldiers now who are very well trained and experienced in the use of arms and in combat, in actual combat. And so Malory was apparently in one of these gangs who broke into people's houses, and they would steal whatever they could and intimidate the people along the way. And Malory, we sometimes think of our writers as great, wonderful people. Well, sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And Malory is supposed to have gone to one of these great houses, and he and his men broke in and not only stole the stuff, but Malory found the woman of the house so attractive that he raped her, and apparently was so taken with her that he went back the next night and raped her again. Well, eventually Malory was captured, and he was thrown into prison. And he was actually into prison more than once in his adult life. And while he was in prison, he started reading books. He started reading Arthurian romances and histories and chronicles. And gradually, to pass the time away, he started writing some of these himself. And so the Morte d'Arthur is actually a series of interlocked romances, which begin with literally the conception of Arthur, and come through his birth, his youth, his coming to the kingship, through his being able to draw Excalibur, the magic sword, out of the stone, and therefore become the king over England. And then, of course, through the early adventures and exploits of Arthur, his founding of the Round Table, and then, of course, the knights and ladies of the Round Table, and the story of Lancelot and Guinevere and the various other knights and their exploits along the way. The Grail legend figures into this. And then, of course, finally, the breaking apart, the tragic ending of this whole Arthurian world. Well, that's Sir Thomas Malory. And very, very interesting guy in his own right. And it's also true that had he not been thrown into prison and very rightly and justly so, for the crimes that he had committed. But had he not been thrown into prison, he never would have done the reading and research necessary to write this great work, and he never would have had the time and the leisure to undertake the writing of this great work. So out of all of this, at least we did get one of our masterpieces of Arthurian literature. It's an interesting story, by the way, to consider, because while Dante was not a criminal, Dante had been part of, in Italy, had been part of a coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat, and he was thwarted, and he was exiled in this civil war, as it were, in Florence. He was into forced exile, and even when a general amnesty later on was declared, Dante alone was excluded from that general amnesty. And so he was a kind of exile and outlaw himself. And it was only because of that, because his career had been a professional politician. It was only because of that that he had the time, the opportunity, and the leisure to write the Divine Comedy, one of the great works in world literature. So it's interesting how sometimes, people's personal tragedies or personal misfortunes can turn out to be just enormously rich and productive in a certain way. And of course, there are other examples of this, but we won't need to go into those now. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a little earlier than Malory. It is composed in the northwest of England. We know that in large part because of the dialect of Middle English, which is being represented for us here, and also because there are certain geographical references that would place the action of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the northwest of England, probably in the borderland with Wales, somewhere around the edge of northern England, where it comes into contact with the northern part of Wales. And in this romance, we're going to begin talking about romance as a form. And while we're going to take a break here in just a moment, let's just talk about some of the characteristics, and then when we come back from our break, we will be talking about this further. A romance is a narrative, usually a long narrative, though it can be a short narrative. A narrative focusing mainly on the courtly class, though figures from other classes may be represented. They're usually kings and queens and dukes and duchesses and knights and ladies, but you can have lower class people typically as minor characters. The plots of romances are typically centered on some kinds of tests or quests. Some kinds of tests or quests, and clearly that's going to be true in the case of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Either in performing heroic feats or in tests or quests for love, usually a lady love, or both, a mixture of the performance of heroic feats and the questing for the love of a lady love. And so these are often combined, as we shall see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight after we break.